Hello, everybody. Welcome to this evening's event. I'm delighted to see so many of you here after the last 2 years where we've had quite a strange time. Although we did just about manage to squeeze in our AJA 60 events with a full attendance, that was great. As I've already mentioned, we celebrated our 60th year anniversary last year. The 60 Years and 60 Buildings exhibition and booklet documented what has been achieved by the architects and the AGA during its first 60 years. So we're now into our 61st year, where with the first ever joint presidency of Mike and myself, so we're hoping to do lots of exciting events in the future. So already Mike has been very energetic and has put together a great programme. And tonight, so we're delighted that Stephen could come on such short notice.
Well, wow. Evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Perhaps it's the free bar. This is the first in the series of evening talks the AJA has programmed for 2022 and 2023. And we're hoping to encourage discussion around the 6 C's, which are the sort of our tool for understanding what good design is all about. The 6 C's, as I'm sure a lot of you know, are context, character, connectivity, community, climate, and change. So they cover issues like island identity, architecture and good design, sustainability, placemaking, our housing crisis, community engagement, biodiversity, public art, townscape, heritage, and so on. Hopefully you'll have a copy of our programme on your seat, and you can see what an amazing range of speakers have agreed to come to Jersey. From architects to engineers, artists, developers, and even a best-selling author. There'll also be a more locally focused series of lunchtime talks at the Société. There'll be more news on these to come. We really want to encourage everybody to join in the discussions about how we can improve our built environment. When I was young, after finishing architecture school, I spent 10 years working in London, half of the time 4 years at Grimshaw's, and then over half the time for Will Alsop. And that's where I met Stephen some 30 years ago. It's been great to keep in touch with him, and even better that he's been able to come here and talk to us. Apart from the very cool name, his practice, Spark Architects, design an impressive range of exciting projects and are highly innovative thinkers. I'd like to think that some of Spark's spark came from those Alsop days, but we'll have to wait and see. So a big welcome to Jersey, Stephen, and over to you.
Thank you, Mike. So sweet. True words indeed. 30 years ago, I still look youthful. What happened to you? That's rude, sorry. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing in Asia over the last 22 years. But before I do that, all conversations have to have a starting point. And there are a couple of projects I did before I started my own practice that meant an awful lot to me, and I'll tell you why. When I graduated in 1984, I was incredibly lucky enough to work for Richard Rogers and Partners, as it then was, on a number of projects, but this perhaps was the most interesting for me, and I'll tell you a little bit why. When I was in school, finished at the RCA, and I'm sure Mike will attest to this, there were sort of 2 camps of thought that were prevalent at that time. One was postmodernism, and the other one was British high-tech architecture. But a lot of people say you couldn't call high-tech a style. But I was enamored with British high-tech because I loved its legibility. I loved the component nature of it. And I always liked to draw sort of nuts and bolts and staircases. So, as I said, I was very lucky enough to be offered a job at Richard Rogers and fell into it. But to my sort of shock, I ended up working on this project that was sort of produced by Norman Rosenthal at the Royal Academy under the banner of Rogers, Foster and Stirling. So funnily enough, I sat in a taxi with Norman, Richard and Mr. Big Jim himself, which, in 7th heaven. as an architect. But I suppose what was surprising about that project was my understanding or getting to know that Richard was really interested in urbanism. It wasn't just about high-tech nuts and bolts. And this was a bit of a surprise to me, and sort of maybe I was a little bit stupid when I was studying, that I didn't understand the greater philosophy of architecture and the importance of the thinking behind how architecture can contribute to cities. So this project was my sort of first immersion in that sort of urbanist bath, if you like, where Richard placed a great importance, as was sort of borne out in his projects like the Pompidou Centre, about making places for people. And this project was exactly about that, turning the north embankment of the Thames from what is ostensibly a highway into a linear park, and then changing Trafalgar Square from the roundabout that it used to be into a beautiful place for people, which it now is, but not designed by Richard Rogers. It was designed later as a Millennium Project by Norman Foster. So understanding that architecture, don't worry about the sort of high-tech nature of the bridge, whether you like it or hate it, that's not really the point. It's about making connections across the river, making connections in the city, and making places for people. And I suppose that's the first of your 6 C's, connectivity. I can't remember the rest, but we'll get to them probably. So this was a big step forward for me in learning to be an architect, and I've carried the sort of quite simplistic messages of that project through with me over the last 30 or 40 years. When I left Rogers, I went to work with 2 guys who worked for Rogers. Then I went to work quite quickly for Will Alsop on this project. The Grand Bleu was the project architect for the sort of 4-year generation from its design implementation through to the construction of the project. And I'm not going to say too much about it, but I suppose at that time it was the last of François Mitterrand's Grand Projet, and I suppose one of the largest projects being built in Europe at that time, or anywhere actually. It's nearly 150,000 square meters. I thought, I'm never going to work on a project of this scale again. And it's testament to Will's ability that he was able to sort of understand a project of that sort of scale and piece it together in quite a mechanically interesting way. And again, it was an extraordinary learning curve for me, but what stayed with me is learning to deal with the scale of that sort of project, because in Europe, it might have been a large project at that time, but in Asia, where I work now, it's an average size project. And the third project, which is in my hometown, Cardiff, was part of a series of quangos that was set up by Mr. Heseltine and Margaret Thatcher. You know, they did a lot of damage, particularly to the sort of Welsh coalfields, shutting them all down, but they did set up these extraordinary businesses in the UK, in Cardiff, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, and the Royal Docks in London. The sort of quangos set up to regenerate sort of disused parts of cities. You know, the lifeblood that used to support Cardiff in the 1930s was the coal industry. You know, it was the biggest coal exporter anywhere in Europe at that time. But over a period of time, that changed and it became quite degraded. And the year I was born, in 1959, the docklands of Cardiff looked like this. I remember my parents saying to me, oh, you know, you can't go there. It was only until the sort of advent of the punk rock movement in 1976, 77, that we went to Cardiff to go to these dodgy nightclubs. But it was pretty awful. And then Lord Trahan set in motion this project, huge regeneration project that required an act of Parliament to get it built, the Cardiff Bay Barrage, which both of us were fortunate enough to work on at that time. So being my hometown, seeing again something of such a scale and having such a political importance and about the regeneration of the city, again, has stayed with me. So moving to Asia, the first project I did was Clark Quay, which is the regeneration of a very old district of the city, what they call in Southeast Asia shop houses. And this is where the trade came in from the Straits of Singapore into the city on what they call bumboats. So it could be anything, rice, sugar, saffron, all things like that, taken off the boats and into the shop houses. And over time, it became rather disused and rather ugly. Nobody really knew what to do with it. And then our client, Capital Land, bought it and asked us to look at regenerating it. They had a previous scheme produced in the late 1980s, I think, that had failed very badly. And after our intervention, it regularly gets 12 million visitors a year, which is an extraordinary achievement. It's basically a nighttime district. And we put these umbrellas over the roofs, having the client saying to us, actually, you want to air condition it, because everything is air conditioned in Southeast Asia, as you probably know, to try and get rid of the humidity. But we persuaded the client to naturally ventilate it. Sustainability wasn't really a talking point in Asia at that time. But again, we managed to convince them to cover the streets, naturally ventilate them, and blow a sort of riverine-like breeze through the streets that gives you physiological cooling. So the temperature in the streets is reduced by about 4 degrees. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it makes them very comfortable. Not 5 degrees, I lie. So it's very successful, and lots of tourists go there and became part of the brand identity of the city for a long time. And it was the first project in Southeast Asia to use ETFE foil as well. After this, the Beijing Olympic swimming pool used foil, but this was the first time. And there was a lot of process of getting agrément certificates, etc., to make it work. And it's a great, fun project, and it's full of people all the time. So, architecture, even though it looks a little bit alien to the city, can be a great fun for place and conviviality, I think. And as I said, it became used in sort of advertising on airlines and in the city about a great place for people to be, a great tourism destination. It's rather ironic that when we were starting the project, the Urban Planning Authority in Singapore, which is a bit stuffy, I have to say, was very opposed to this project. And they said, Stephen, if you go up on top of the hill in Singapore and look down, you'll be able to see this and it'll look awful. So you dutifully go to the top of the hill, can't see it at all. So they were opposed to it, and it was only our client having quite a lot of financial muscle and saying to the planning authority, if you don't allow us to do this, the whole place is going to be disused and negative, a lot of negative energy until somebody does something about it. So they gave in, we built this, and then ironically, they're sort of using it in advertising when it's all done. So, nice story. So we do an awful lot of commercial projects. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them, but some of them are quite interesting, some of them are a little bit boring, but we did this project for the same client of Clarke Quay, Capital Land, and this is one of their sort of ubiquitous projects. It's called Rattle City. It sits on a very important street in Beijing, if you all know Beijing. It's on Dongzhimin, quite close to the Forbidden City. And it has their usual business components: office building, serviced apartments, apartments to rent, and retail. And what I was saying about the scale of Marseille, this is larger than the Marseille project. This is nearly 180,000 square meters. And what's nice about it is the way it's occupied by people on the outside. You can never really predict how your projects are going to be used. But the spaces outside, the courtyards outside the building, and the landscape sort of gave rise to gatherings of people in the nighttime, sort of dancing around. It's wonderful, actually. It's better than inside the building, which is, as you'll see in a moment. So this is a section through the project, quite dense, on quite a tight urban site. But it had some very special components. This is called the Crystal Lotus that sits at the heart of the building. And it's there because the plan is quite deep, perhaps too deep for a typical retail shopping mall. So we decided to break the space and put this sort of glass plug in the center that's got specialty shops inside it and vertical accommodation. And of course, it's quite early on in China. It's nearly 18 years ago now. So we produced, using sort of sophisticated software, a lot of flattened out drawings, folded out drawings of this and the roof structure, etc. But when it was built in a very sort of agricultural manner by the contractor. They didn't understand these drawings. They're using pieces of string to sort of set out quite dynamic roofing structure, which, to the horror of our engineers, Arabs, said they didn't work, and the roof was going to collapse, but it hasn't collapsed yet. So that's the swimming pool and the roof over the atrium space. So it uses this tessellated geometry. This is before sort of a current mathematical finding of roof structures. So it's a sort of, I suppose, a leitmotif that runs through the whole building, this triangulated surface. And it's got a metro station below it as well, and that's the connection to the metro and the sort of section of the building. And here you can see people sort of occupying the spaces outside at night time. Very nice sort of picture of urbanity in Beijing. I also worked on this project that started while Will was still alive, and then carried on after he'd moved away from his original company. This is called the Shanghai International Cruise Terminal. And again, it sits in a very important part in the city. The old Bund of Shanghai, let's see if this works, is here. The old buildings from the 1920s and 30s are here. So Mayor Han, who was the mayor at the time in Shanghai, wanted, as in sort of a lot of European cities, to extend the sort of public pathway all the way along the Bund, across Suzhou Creek, which is here, and extend it out towards the river in this direction. So a big garden allowing people to access the riverfront that had been predominantly sort of public domain of docklands, I suppose, at the time came to the fore. So here you can see the garden that we landscaped as well, and the buildings, which are, I suppose they're more like pavilions. They're not particularly large. They're about 20,000 square meters each, because the government wanted to keep the height of these buildings low because of the master planning of the buildings behind them, so they could look down over the river. So there's a lot of control over it. But at the center, there's this quite exuberant space that's an archway. And it's an arch because we couldn't take any vertical load down at that point because there's a tunnel under the river. So these quite interesting sort of objects that were initially designed to be cafes and restaurants that are now being leased by Ferrari to sell branded goods. And here you can see a sort of a chappie here sort of finishing off the cladding. So it's quite dynamic, quite theatrical at night time, and is the gateway from the road, Darming Road in the north, to this new embankment garden in the south. So it is a gateway to the river. The next are two projects that we've done for the same developer in Malaysia. This is on the island of Penang, that you may know, which is one of the old states of Malaysia. It's two residential towers that are the tallest twin towers in Penang. The one at the back is a residence, and this is a hotel tower. So it looks very complicated, the geometry, but it's quite simplistic actually, that the apartments and the cores sort of go right the way through as a vertical sort of cantilevered core. And then the slabs of the apartments are twisted slightly. They sort of rotate around the building, giving it this very sort of curvaceous geometry. And then at the sort of mid-level in the apartment tower, there are two pods. One is a jacuzzi pod, here, so you can have a jacuzzi looking out over the straits. And this is a clubhouse, again, that gives you fantastic views over the straits. So the residents can hire these for events, just the same way as this room is being hired for the evening. You get wonderful views. And then the top of the podium, top of the car parking deck, is turned into sort of gymnasium and swimming pool, aqua aerobics for the residents and for the hotel. And for the same developer, we recently finished this project in Kuala Lumpur in the Mont Kiara district, which is predominantly a residential district of the city, which is right at the heart of Kuala Lumpur. And we didn't start this project. There was another architect involved who designed this quite boring series of 3 towers, which the client didn't like at all. And they said, well, can you do something interesting with it? So we came up with this these series of fins that are based on his thumbprint, which he quite liked the idea of that. So that's what we did. We clad the towers with his thumbprint. So they become quite iconic. I hate that word, actually, iconic. I don't. Let's try and stop using it. So they become interesting on the skyline of Kuala Lumpur. And a project that I was talking to somebody about a little while ago in Shenzhen, which is quite close to Hong Kong. If you ever went to Hong Kong back in the 80s, this was the point of crossing between Hong Kong and the People's Republic of China. It was a very small place back then. It's like 80,000 people, and it's now nearly 40 million people. And it's quite extraordinary, the way that Shenzhen has grown. It's now the sort of high-tech capital of China, producing all sorts of wonderful softwares. So our project, and the reason I'm showing it to you, you can see the sort of figure ground plan here. It's quite permeable, deliberately so, to engage with the streets that sit around it. So people can move around it. It becomes like a city living room, in effect. And there you can see the sort of diagrams. It's got a bus station and a metro station that sit to one side and below the building. But the permeability of the plan is quite important to bring people into this new courtyard, the living room that's the building. So there you can see the sort of diagram that proves that. And at the center, there's this sort of lantern-type building that hovers over the courtyard space. This is the connection down to the metro and the basement shopping areas, and the terraces around it. It's basically, I suppose it's an open-air shopping mall, and there are not a lot of these in Southeast Asia because of climate control. But it's a much more sustainable way of developing the sort of shopping center typology, especially where the climate is not too bad. It's quite temperate in Shenzhen. It's not really humid like Singapore, and it's quite relatively warm. So it's perfectly appropriate for natural ventilation and providing this sort of space. So here you can see one of the openings to the street that bring people into that courtyard. So it's been very successful, fortunately. And one that we're working on at the moment that's under construction, again, very commercial in its disposition, is a hotel tower in Chengdu. One of the most beautiful cities in China, actually, Chengdu. They have a very different, I suppose, culture and characteristic to the people there. It's much more slow-paced. It's a much more green environment, Chengdu. So if you're ever going to China, make sure you visit Chengdu. They've got a great affinity with tea. So there's a lot of tea drinking that goes on there. But they've also got these extraordinary pools outside the city called Huanglong, these mineral pools that are very beautiful. So we like the idea of those pools and the terraces you find. They're trying to bring in terracing into the architecture so we can green it in the future. So this is one of our images of the project. It's here, so you can see it's terraced at the base too. I suppose it's about giving quite tall buildings, this is 150 meters, I think, trying to give it some sort of scale that's a little bit more human. If you go to Shanghai, you go to Beijing, you see all these tall towers. The street level is pretty awful, that they don't care about how the buildings relate to the urban plane. So this is about trying to give you some sort of scale of measurement and breaking down the architecture. So it has a better scale. It's a nicer place for people to be at a lower level. So we spent a lot of time developing the buildings around the base of the building. This is a new art center that we're designing for the client, who aren't Marriott, but it's the owner of the building, who's a photographer, a very famous photographer in China. So this is where he's going to show his work. And this building is clad with aluminium foam, which is quite an interesting material if you don't know it. It's sort of aluminium under pressure with gas that creates this extraordinary sort of natural type honeycomb. So the gallery that we're designing is going to be clad with aluminium foam. So here you can see the terracing of the architecture. before you get to the very tall tower where the hotel is. This is all retail, shopping and F&B. And the site under construction about 6 months ago. Very messy sites in China, unfortunately. Quite hazardous. So a different type of retail project. And I suppose it falls in the canon of what can you do with buildings if you don't knock them down? And there is a prevalence in Asia to demolish things, particularly in places like Hong Kong where the land values are so high. Get rid of it, start again, increase the height, increase the density. So you face that quite a lot. But, you know, one of your other C's is about conservation and trying to look at what you can do with buildings that perhaps are not so old. And this is a project that we've done in the heart of Singapore, in the arts district called Seligi. This image and the text on the image, again, is quite important to the way we think. And it's stolen from Nick Sirota. You know who Nick Sirota is. He was the leader of the Tate Gallery. And when I was working with Will, we did the competition for Bankside, which was eventually won by Herzog de Meuron. But Nick dutifully came round to all the architects and sat down and talked to us about his ambition. And he said, you know, we don't want to convert Bankside, we want to transform it. And I think that's quite important, actually, that you didn't want a simple conversion of Bankside, but you wanted, well, we tried to transform it, but Herzog de Meuron had completely transformed it in terms of people's opinion of what the Tate could be and the implications that the Tate had on the embankment and that part of London. Completely changed it. So it's not just transformative as a building, but transformative as an urban transform as well, which is extraordinarily exciting. So that message from Nick Sirota sort of stayed with me as well. So this is the building as we took it over. It wasn't designed that long ago, actually, maybe early part of the millennium, maybe 2001, 2002. But it had this rather awful glass facade. And then it's like a 4-story void with no retail value at all. So we've changed it to this quite mechanical architecture. You could call it slightly high-tech, but it's sort of youth-focused shopping, which is a little bit different in Singapore. Singapore has got a plethora of these very stuffy shopping malls that we call sort of auntie style in Singapore. They're all very beige and brown, very calm. This is nothing like that. It's quite in your face, quite funky, but it's focused on a youth market. So that's the before and that's the after. But there is some sort of sense to what we're doing. You know, it's not just fun, it's not just about creating willful pieces of architecture. It's taking space that was dead inside, because again, like Raffles City, Beijing, it's a very deep plan, not earning the client any money. You walk in, you can't see the shops at the back, so nobody really wanted to rent them. So we took them out. We took the GFA out, the gross floor area, out of those places, cut a hole in the slab which connects the ground floor to the basement, so you get some daylight into the basement and you can see the activities in the basement. But importantly, it helps us move that floor area that was in the center of the building to the corner here. So this is the high traffic area. This is where the most value for the building is created. So we took precious area from the center and put it outside, where it's earning 4 times as much money. So we also added a staircase, which is like a sort of urban connection. Again, going back to that word, connectivity. It's about trying to drive footfall from the neighborhood and adjacent buildings into our building and then down into the basement. So it's a sort of social staircase, a place for younger people to be, that you'll see in a moment. So at nighttime, it's very vibrant, very active, a little bit like the sort of archway that you saw in Shanghai. But the rationale behind this, across the street, which you can't see at the moment, there are very lively shop houses, which is sort of a bar and eating district in the city that's very colourfully lit. And if you've been to Singapore and seen the old Chinese shop houses, they're painted in these sort of very vibrant pastels, if that makes sense. Vibrant pastels? No, they're quite primary pastels. They're sort of Andy Warhol type colours. So some plans, that's the social staircase. The corner, is a delight for bloggers and social media, capturing the sort of energy of the space. And the interior, again, it's very colourful, very dynamic. Even the bathrooms, the sort of selfie booths rather than just toilets. Not that I've been in there taking photographs of myself. So it's all good fun, and it's been well received, I think. The entrance from the main road. I suppose, in terms of its aesthetic, it owes more to, we were talking the other evening about the hacienda in Manchester, it owes more to that sort of language than it does to sort of conventional retail mall interior design that you find in Singapore. So here, this is the sort of vibrant Seligi Arts District. So it's really taking its clue from that, sort of completing the other side of the street. And it sits against some quite interesting old buildings, but they're quite dull, I suppose. It's really set the character of the street alight, I think. We did everything. We designed the logo, we did the branding and the interiors and the architecture. It was quite fun. But what's nice about it is, I said, the sort of impact that social media has had on all our lives. You see the best photographs that are being taken from the building are about bloggers, I think, are the ones that I find most interesting, because they look at the building in a very different way, looking at it in quite a sort of sculptural and artistic way that perhaps we don't. So these are some of the photographs of the building that you see on the internet. Fantastic, I think. So I want to talk a little bit about the sort of master plan work that we do. Sort of loosely titled it Reflective Nostalgia, which you'll understand why. And the first project is the Guangzhou shipyard, which sits here. It's the old international shipyard, one of the most important shipyards in China that started in 1910. This is the Pearl River, so it's a very important river in China, sort of passing the site here. And when you first go there, you see, it's like Cardiff Bay all over again. It's the lifeblood that was the city, which has gone elsewhere because it's very expensive to manufacture ships here. Now it's all in Taiwan or somewhere else. The sort of economic roller coaster that goes on has gone somewhere else. It's left Guangzhou and it's disappeared. So what on earth do you do with these big sites? You need somebody like Michael Heseltine behind it to say, well, we're setting up a Quango here, this is what you do. But of course, in China, it's a combination of the government and private enterprise that do it, perhaps similar to the times of Margaret Thatcher and Heseltine. But, you become enamored with photographs like this because as architects and designers, you're interested really in the way things that are put together. So the nature of shipbuilding really informed, I suppose, a lot of the things that I was thinking about, not just for the master plan, but the buildings that sat on the master plan as well. So this is the master plan. It's the sort of size of Canary Wharf, if you know Canary Wharf. It's about 1.6 million square meters of real estate development that will be built over the next 10 years. So although we've done the master plan, of course we won't do all the architecture and just focus on certain parts. So this is our area here, the sort of central courtyard, maybe this tower, and then the riverfront here. So these are the pieces that we're concentrating on. So it's a government developer with a private developer called CITIC, who are also partly government-based. But the master plan has a number of zones, of course, because it's so large. So there's a commercial zone that wraps around the central courtyard and the waterfront, and then the residential and lifestyle zones that move out east and west. So unlike Canary Wharf when it was built by the Reichmann brothers in the 80s and early 90s, which was, I suppose at that time, monocultural, it was all office space. I suppose lots of people have learned the lessons from that that it's impossible to make a project like that work because it's got very much, an 8:30 to 5:30 lifespan, and at the weekends it was dire going to Canary Wharf because there was nobody there. The retail centre didn't work. So this has got everything. It's got schools, it's got hospital, it's got a lot of office space, but it's got all the other facilities. So it's, it's not 9 to 5, it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it's an image that was approved by the government. It's the master plan. And you can see the sort of language of the architecture that's come on from Cardiff Bay and the Cardiff Bay Visitor Centre, and the sort of nature of that sort of shipbuilding type geometries that we use for the building. And Mr. Mason reminded me a little bit earlier on, Derek to his friends, put in a plug for La Frégate. Well, this is my plug for it. I did work on the building with Derek a long time ago, which was a very enjoyable process, actually. So that, again, to me, understanding the way buildings are put together, the sort of shipbuilding technology, has sort of informed a lot of the thinking in my career, and this is an opportunity to sort of design buildings like that are not cafes, but they're cultural buildings that sit facing the river, almost putting their toes in the water, cantilevering over the edge of the old docks and the sort of slipways. So some other images of the project, the retention of some of the big old warehouses and the new boardwalks across the buildings. And then trying to, again, make places that have a nice scale for people when the buildings are relatively tall. Even the shorter buildings, they're over 120 meters tall. So again, this is about moderating the scale of the enclosures and the sort of F&B streets, and curating the ground plane and curating the sort of first and second levels of all the office towers to create sort of like a high line type effect. And sort of learning from streets around the world that I like very much, like this Marunouchi Nakadori in Tokyo, which during the week is a sort of business street, but then it's closed for the weekends and it sort of takes over, becomes very different in the sort of social demographic that it attaches. So we're trying to bring that sort of aesthetic into what we're doing for the back lane of this project, which is very much about lifestyle, eating and drinking and having a good time. And then the old docks, what do you do with the old docks? Well, one's turned into cinema spaces and again, more F&B spaces. And then this is the heart of the project. This is where the infrastructure comes up. This is where the metro line engages with the wider master plan. So the metro is behind us, basically where I'm standing here. So when you arrive at the lower level here or at the upper level, you have this enormous canopy and an exhibition building at its heart. So it's not a spectacular, or it will be a spectacular gateway between the arrival threshold and the river space as well. So another master plan project, but loosely titled Social Picturesque, which I'll explain to you as we go along. This is one that's current and on the drawing boards at the moment. We won a competition last year to sort of master plan this island in Suzhou, and if you know anything about Suzhou, you'll know that it's a very famous water city in China, not that far from Shanghai, actually. It's got very beautiful traditional Chinese gardens that have an interesting, I suppose, layering of the spaces that are involved in the threshold and the way you move, and the perspective changes as you go through. So it's very well controlled, but you always see something in the distance that carries you through. So we're trying to use those ideas in the way that we master planned the space. And it has at the center this sort of Chinese type garden, and then a ring around the outside that connects all the new buildings that will happen here in the future. So this was part of our competition entry point. So here you can see the sort of traditional Suzhou Chinese gardens, and then inspired by paintings like La Grande Jatte by Seurat, which is about perambulation, really. It's about standing and sort of picnicking and looking at the river and looking what's in the distance. So for me, that's very much the idea of social picturesque, that you're providing places of rest, points of interest for people, where they can see the next destination. So it's about curating that experience and creating a sort of a route for these people to take that's also quite interesting before they get there. So some of the master plan diagrams that, you have this sort of ring of interesting projects that sit around it, and then views from those buildings through the lake that connects them all together. So having done the master plan, I finished it last year, we're now designing the first phase of the project, which is here, which is a market area, a water street, and some studio spaces that will be leased to designers. So this has started construction. The site images you saw at the beginning is the site cleared of all the sort of old industrial buildings that were there. So that's the plan of phase one and some images of it. So there's a gallery building here. There's a site for the studios that will be rented out with another gallery here, and then sort of market and market streets here. So it's about just over 80,000 square meters of real estate. This is the entrance to the market area, the sort of B1 area and the car park either side, and the sort of arrival sequence, and then the water street. So I go back one, actually. You see what I mean about that sort of picturesque idea. You're standing on the threshold of the street, and in the distance you see one of the future buildings here. So I suppose it's curating the journey for people. Minhang in China, which is a district of Shanghai. Again, we won a master plan competition to really look at the center of Minhang district, which, like a lot of the outer lying districts of Shanghai, is trying to improve itself quite a lot, basically to earn more revenue and to attract new businesses and to increase the population. So central government in Shanghai has commissioned a lot of these outer districts to sort of really revamp themselves. So Minhang has this very important river. Well, you wouldn't think it's terribly important to look at it because, like the River Thames, as Mike said to me yesterday, is really forgotten about. London, to a certain extent, has turned its back on the river, unlike places like Paris. And this is very much the case in Minhang, where as the city has expanded, there's been a lot of urbanism and redevelopment, and that redevelopment has really turned its back to the river, unfortunately, and there's a lot of degraded warehouses. You can't really get to the river, and it just became a dumping ground. So it's like a found space, almost. So we were given the commission to look at two areas, one which connects the city infrastructure here and the main road and the connection to a university that sits here. So this is phase two. And then the river here is the first phase that we've tackled. So that's the plan of it. It includes 3 bridges that cross the river at different points. So it's about, again, connectivity. It's about increasing the land value. But it's also about making a wonderful place for residents to increase the amount of sort of conviviality, which sounds a little bit ironic when Shanghai is in lockdown and nobody's allowed to go out. But, in the future, there will be lots more people here. So the sort of idea I had, which was about this sort of social wavelength of communication, and then diatoms, if you know what diatoms are, they're sort of algae that clean water. So it's not just about increasing communication between spaces and people, but it's about regeneration of the sort of water, the infrastructure that supplies this space with its sort of extraordinary quality. And some sketches of the bridges I did at the start of the project. So that's one of the main bridges that crosses the river. So nobody had this experience previously. You're confined to spaces that were maybe 40 meters away from the river, so you never really perceived it. So now people can actually walk across it and see the river in a whole new light. And we've done lots of measures about cleaning it up. So it's quite clean now. And the landscaping that we designed has this sort of riparian language as well, that it's sort of flowing like the river and creates different zones for different activity and sort of bicycling and performance. But you can see the sort of area that's had nothing done to it, which is pretty grim compared to the first side that we've tackled. So it's a great place for people. And then you can see in this extraordinary photograph, there's a bridge here and the two bridges here. So this is phase 1, and phase 2 will be along here. So this is all government-led work, and quite a progressive government actually, because they want to increase, as I said before, all the land values here, get rid of these sort of low common denominator warehousing functions, and replace it with high-tech industry, which is a burgeoning economy in Shanghai at the moment. So the sort of last part of this talk I've called Future Perfect, because when we have time and we're not working on projects like that, we sort of do our own think pieces or thought pieces that we loosely call research projects. This is quite an old one. I suppose the debate about waste plastics and ocean pollution through plastics wasn't such a prevalent topic that it is currently. I'm not saying I invented the idea, but it was a long time before David Attenborough picked up on it. And there was only one, they're not mentioned here. So we all know about plastic now, we all know it's a big problem. Even though my father-in-law was the head physicist at BP Plastics, so he was inventing all these bloody compounds that we now can't get rid of. So blame him, Dennis Lannon. He's now dead, but I'm sure it's a problem in Jersey as well, as it is in Singapore, with a lot of crap washed up on the beaches. The Singaporeans every day are out sweeping the beaches to get rid of it. Because the Straits is full of all these huge tankers, hundreds and hundreds of boats parked in the Straits, dumping crap that washes up onto the beaches, but miraculously it's gone every day. But a lot of places around the world you get this detritus, and you get these huge currents in the ocean, the gyres in the ocean that collect rubbish in particular areas, and you get these massive garbage patches that are phenomenally big, mind-bogglingly big. So I first heard about ocean plastics maybe 8 years ago through this organization called Parley for the Oceans. They're a sort of non-profit organization based in New York that have been talking about it and sort of beating the drum about doing something about ocean plastics for a long time. And then bright young sparks like Pharrell Williams, the sort of the American pop singer, set up his own brand of clothing, or he bought into a brand of clothing called G-Star Raw, who make all their clothes these days from, they call it bionic yarn, which is basically plastics that have been reused and turned into clothes. Just like Adidas, the old fishing nets turned into wonderful sneakers. So there are lots of things you can do with plastics. So I think, well, we should get in on the act. So this is about collecting, cleaning, and recycling plastics. And then the idea we had on the beaches where I go walking, I was going to say running, but I would have lied. I go walking along the beach in the morning in Singapore. These casuarina trees that have these wonderful tiny little seeds. So I'm thinking about the sort of evolution of beach huts. And beach huts, because in Singapore, a lot of young people live with their parents and, up to the age of about 30 before they get married. And then they go camping on the beach so they can be with their girlfriends or whatever and have sex on the weekends. Not to upset their parents, but so the beaches in Singapore are full of tents on the weekend. So I was quite intrigued by this idea. So there is this sort of idea of where did the beach hut start and where could it go to? So there's an evolution from the grass hut to the sort of Victorian beach huts that you find on the north coast of Norfolk and elsewhere in Britain. And then my idea of the sort of Casuarina C-type beach hut made out of recycled HDPE2, which is predominantly the sort of plastics that you find in containers, that drinking bottles, etc., detergent bottles. And it's also the plastic that my daughter used for these little things she used to have called hammer beads, and she used to spend hours making these little things. And hammer beads are quite interesting because you set them together on a frame. I'm sure you've all done it at one point in your life. And then you put a grease-proof sheet of paper over the top, and then you get an iron out, and then you fuse them all together with a little bit of heat. So HDPE2 is very malleable as a plastic and can easily be recycled, as these tests prove. So you get these sort of wonderful concoctions of plastic. So these are our tests of plastics in the office. And then these are the beach huts. So we've taken the HDPE2, and they basically form large-scale shingles that are attached to a frame. And then the tops of the shingles are coated with thin film PV, so they generate some power. So there's a fan inside. So they're quite sustainable. So that's the way the structure goes together. You have a glulam timber frame on a recycled concrete structure that's micro-piled into the beach, and then the shingles clad the buildings. Quite simple idea. And it gives you phenomenal sort of views over the beach. So sort of engaging to look at, and when they light up at night, you know, they're quite picturesque in a way. So we've been trying to sell this idea to the Singapore Tourism Board, who like the idea very much, but of course they want somebody else to pay for it. So we're open to offers. And this sort of inspired by the sort of first Johnny Ive IMAX, where they had all the IMAX in a series. So you can get these in all sorts of colours. It's just about sorting out the plastics and reproducing them. Another sort of research project I did, which is a little bit more serious, I suppose, than the beach hut. It looks at the sort of condition of aged living in Asia, because Singapore, like places, is like Japan, I suppose, which has got the worst balance of young people to old people, where, you know, nappies for old people are outselling nappies for babies, which was such a horrible thought. Let's move on from that quickly. So yes, Asia is a very aging society. And in Singapore as well, that because of rapid urbanization from the late 60s and 70s, all the farmland that used to be in Singapore, you know, post-imperialism and sort of early days of the Malaysian Federation, it's all gone. It's not, you know, it's like concrete with a few sort of pockets of very beautiful gardens in Singapore. But ostensibly, there's no farming. Everything is imported. And also, you've got this problem about, whoops, I did it again, sorry. You've got this problem about, you've got lots of old people and you've got no young people to look after them. So, you know, old people are consigned to aged care living centres that are on the periphery of town. There's no interaction between younger generation and older generation, which is terribly sad. You know, I don't bloody want to turn out like this. Somebody spoon-feeding me chicken rice. You know, I want to live in a garden. Like my mother, like my grandmother, very engaged with the garden environment. You know, great place to retire, so why can't that happen? So we came up with an idea, we called it Home Farm, which is like market gardening and aged care living put together, where people who live there can earn revenue from growing vegetables, growing leaves, etc., that can be sold into the local economy. So the interstices of this place is like a big open courtyard. Again, it's engaged with the streets around it. And the apartments sit behind these green screens, so they're shaded from the temperatures in Singapore. And it uses aquaponic farming to grow the foodstuffs. And it has within it all the things that you'd find in a sort of traditional kampong village, sort of healthcare facilities, a food court, gymnasium facilities, supermarket, club and all those sorts of things that people are used to in Singapore. And then it's quite sustainable in the way it works. It uses sort of aquaponic farming that's from a fish farm that's on the roof and collection of natural rainwater. And then all the waste that goes through the building is collected in a biomass power station. So it's this 360-degree cycle of energy and production that reduces the energy consumption of the building quite a lot. And in fact, for the people who live there, who are worse off, the lowest of the incomes, they're able to get free power and free food from the gardening and the efforts that they make in producing that. It's not like a ghetto for old people. It's not a labour camp for old people either, actually. But it has a cross-section of the population. It has apartments that are very small, studio apartments, but then it goes up to what they call 3-generation living apartments. So older people can live with their children and their children's children. So it's very much about bringing people back into society and not isolating them from it, because one of the great problems of things like dementia, which there's no cure for, it's about constant engagement, keeps the brain active for a lot longer. So if you're in an environment and a society like this, it's much better for older people. And then, having done that sort of research project, a doctor in Kuala Lumpur asked us to design this project for him, which is sort of Home Farm Mark II, which is configured in a slightly different way. It's a series of apartment buildings plugged into a ring, which is this productive garden that we worked on with Grant Associates and Atelier 10. So all the apartments are sold around it, and they sit around this garden, and then the substrate, like Home Farm, is around the edges here. And in the corner of the development is a hospital that's run by our client, who's the doctor. And the edges of the car park are coated with these algae panels that absorb carbon dioxide. So they take carbon dioxide from the car park and the streets around it and purify the air as well. So inside you've got the growing membranes and substrates, and outside you've got the algae production. So the last project I'm going to talk to you about this evening is called 3 Little Pigs. It's my sketch of the project. It's about creating energy from pig shit. And the reason for that is for every 3 people in China, there's an awful lot of people in China, as you know, there's 1 pig. Chinese love pork for some reason, but there's millions of pigs, creating an awful lot of pig manure. And that finds its way into the water course, because although a lot of pig farming in China is regulated, that's the large-scale pig farms, but 40-50% of these farms are a lot smaller scale, individual farmers, very unregulated, that they just wash the pig manure onto the farm side, and then the rain washes that into the river course, which creates high nutrient levels in all the sort of water, the sort of reservoirs, etc., that kills the fish and creates what's called eutrophication, which basically all this energy that goes in the nutrients go in, suck all the oxygen out and kill everything else, and you get this terrible algae. So eutrophication, so it kills basically everything in the water. And all that's caused by the pig shit being swept away, swept into the farms, then into the water. So when I was a child, I used to spend a lot of time in Spain on holidays with my parents. And you used to see, I'm sure you've all seen sort of films by people like Biggest Luna and Jamón. Wonderful, these big sculptural bulls sitting in the countryside. I thought that was great. It's like, I suppose you used to see the chalk horses in the UK carved into the hillside. These sort of quite interesting sort of abstract monuments. And that combined with things like Jeff Koons' artwork. I mean, you never quite know where an idea comes from. I suppose you've got this sort of collection of stuff that goes in your brain all the time. You have these lexicon of ideas that sometimes they just come together. You don't know quite how or why they come together. But there's the genesis idea. You match the bulls of Veterano Osborne Brandy with Jeff Koons, and you come up with 3 little pigs. I don't quite know how it works, but anyway, so you have the biodigester. You have the biodigester that sits in the ground. You have the drains, etc. And so the farmers can wash the manure into, and it creates gas. And from the gas, of course, you can create energy. You can put it through a combined heat and power plant, which relatively can get them quite small. So it uses the gas to create electricity. So the farmers who are adopting these things get free power. It's a sort of isometric drawing of it. So the pigs are basically like balloons, and they inflate. Just like a sort of gasometer used to grow out of the ground, these pigs become inflated as the amount of pig shit creates a lot of gas. It's quite poetic in a way, isn't it? So then you see these sort of pigs on the horizon, sort of a cluster-like piece of Jeff Koons' artwork. And they're just Teflon, they're coated Teflon. Fab, isn't it? So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for bringing us up to speed on your career for the last 30 years. I think it's fair to say you haven't been hanging around. And thank you for answering my question through your work, which does part of Spark come through the Allsop days. I could see it. I didn't realise, but I could also see it comes from the Richard Rogers days. But what I think was so amazing about your talk is so much of it comes from your own personality and the way in which you've developed from those ideas into your own realm, and that's fantastic. But really, it's not about my questions. Stephen's very kindly offered to answer questions from the audience, so please, this is what it's all about. Please do feel free. We've got a roving mic, and Stephen will answer any questions you've got, so amazing. Thank you.
Only easy questions, please.
Good evening. Thank you for the presentation. It's very provocative. I, like you, I'm just interested in how things are created. And if we scroll back, we don't have the time to do that, but your buildings, that was the thumbprint. Where did the thumbprint idea come from and then translate itself into a building?
I do quite a lot of screen printing, actually, and mono printing in our studio. And when you're mono printing, you sort of study how to make marks using ink and paper, but it's not like screen printing in a conventional sense. You're actually using tools. And they were making some marks that was trying to copy, I can't remember what they're called, the ridges. There's a word for the ridges of your print. So you're trying to make marks like that. And it was through that process of sort of doing the mono printing that we came up with the idea, well, why don't we use those marks? And we took a copy of our client's thumbprint, well, he did it, and sent it to us, and then we scanned them and put them on the building. But as I said, you never quite know where an idea is going to come from. There's a very famous science fiction writer called Isaac Asimov, who wrote about creativity. And then he said that, as I said, you had this sort of storage of ideas that you build up from a child through your university period, through your working life. And then you never know, where these things are going to come from, and you put these two things together. They seem quite natural, that they are always together, and that's the real sort of spark of creativity, I think. But I suppose, we're very lucky in the profession that we work in, that you're attuned, especially when you work with somebody like Will, who's so free in the way he thought about things. You become attuned to that. You're not afraid of trying things or making ideas. What might seem to be quite an absurd idea seems quite natural sometimes. And then you need the courage to be able to talk about that and present it to a client. I think an incumbent might think, oh, no, can't do that because. Will was never like that. He said, do it. You know, you say, you don't need a client to have a good idea.
Talking about clients,
Hello, Mike.
you had your early projects, a lot of them seem to be about the same client. I'm just wondering, tell us who he was and how did it first develop with you?
We do a lot of work with Capitaland, who are probably Asia's largest developer. Started with the Clark Quay project, and we've done a number of these sort of ubiquitous raffle city projects throughout China. And we're now doing a project with them in Ho Chi Minh City. They tend all to be the same. They're mixed-use projects that have a number of typical sort of portfolios that go with them. Residential is a big element. Retail and F&B is a big element. But over the last 20 years, we've done maybe 8 projects with them. They're all very substantive in size. They're all over 100,000 square meters. So very lucky to work with people like that. But then the odd clients, like the guy that we work with in Malaysia, in Penang and One Mont Kiara, is he's a bit odd, I suppose. And there's lots of strange ideas. This is the thumbprint guy. But again, he's great to work with. He doesn't really know what he wants, and he might give you a picture in a magazine that's of an antelope or something and say, make it like that. It's very weird, but quite interesting sort of process. 2 very different sort of people. Because Capitaland, they're a huge organization. They employ thousands of people, and they have lots of sort of design managers that you have to work with who are architects who decided that they don't want to be an architect, but they want to be in the client's team. It's a lot easier sort of route that you don't have to work so hard. You get paid quite well, and then you can tell other architects what to do. So there's a very professional type organization with big developers, and then a very oddball type private developer. So there's a mixed bag of people we work with, but I suppose that's what makes your life interesting in a way.
Sorry, the last person sort of anticipated my question to an extent, but I was going to ask you, as all your projects are based in Asia, how would you sort of compare and contrast the experience of working in Asia compared with Britain, for example?
I haven't really done that many projects in Britain, apart from the barrage and then a project in West Bromwich. But as I said when I was talking about the Marseille project, it was about the scale and understanding the scale of that project, which I thought I'm never going to build anything as large as the Marseille project ever again, but it's an average sized project for us in Asia. But you do need to get your brain around projects of that sort of scale when you're working on them, sort of parts of cities like Guangzhou, and trying to find some sort of logic that ties it all together and makes it a little bit more meaningful. So we invest a lot of energy into walking the client through the spaces. I suppose that's the only way that I can make them work for myself. It's like breaking a big master plan down into a series of buildings. I suppose it's because of your architectural training. You think of it as a master plan of lots of buildings, and then you curate the spaces between those buildings, and slowly a pattern of the master plan emerges. So it's about decomposing, I suppose, the master plan into legible parts that makes the whole meaningful, if that makes any sense. So Marseille helped a lot in understanding big buildings and how they relate to cities, I suppose. Is that a good enough answer? I could try again if you want.
I was wondering whether you had more, if you sort of noticed more of a sort of can-do attitude amongst...
Well, I suppose you get used to it. It's quite scary at the beginning. I suppose the other important thing is about relationships and programs to each other. When you're working on a mixed-use project, that hotels have drop-offs, retail has drop-off, office buildings have drop-offs. And when you're working on a compact urban site, to understand the sort of jigsaw that has to go together seamlessly is quite complicated. And that's quite draining if you've never done one before, sort of working out that jigsaw, because it's quite complicated.
Let's, yeah, let's bring it back down to scale in St Helier and the fragmented nature of this town/city. You talk about courage and creating vision. I mean, this is the one thing we lack in St Helier, is this cohesive thinking, which, I don't know, it just seems like decade after decade, we never seem to change, we never seem to move forward. What is the culture? Is it bringing, I mean, people go, bring in some brilliant architect because the local guys don't know what to do. I think that's rubbish myself, but I mean, because they obviously are very familiar with the local environment and all the rest of it. How do you change government's minds? How do you get people on board
I think
with big projects?
the experience I've had, not in Asia, this is before when I was working with Will, we did quite a lot of projects in the Netherlands, and one in a place in particular called Almere, which was a master plan that had been done by Rem Koolhaas and had a number of quite well-known architects doing different components in that master plan. And there was they'd all get together, and I'd be there with Will, and Rem would be there, and UN Studio were there, and a variety of other people. Neutlings, Rydek, all the sort of great and the good architects in Europe at that time were working on this project. And it was a nightmare. It was fisticuffs, well, not quite fisticuffs, but a lot of disagreement. But the client had a lot of sense to employ what they called the litmus team. So they had their own series of professionals, not employed, well, they were employed by the government, but they were all independent. A landscape architect, an urban planner, an artist, who were the people who sort of, I suppose, were the glue that put all these projects together, that tamed the egos of the architects and sort of straightened their thinking to creating something that was a whole rather than a sort of fragmented series of iconic pieces of architecture. So I think that worked incredibly well, and it's not the only time I've encountered that in Holland, but that was perhaps the best experience. But lots of these city governments like Rotterdam, they employ similar sorts of teams that look at sort of different architectural proposals to make sure there's a level of cohesiveness between them, and I found it a very rewarding exercise, actually, listening to what they had to say, because they're not all architects, they come from different sort of walks of life. So maybe you could try that. I don't know whether it might already exist here, I don't know. You could do it, couldn't you, Mike?
Stephen, I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed that presentation and I found it personally very inspiring.
Thank you, it's sweet of you to say so.
Thank you. I'm a bit of a political activist and environmental campaigner locally. The name is John Baker. I've got a long-term project for St Helier in particular to make it a garden city, and a lot of this is inspiring me. But to facilitate, and that's an important word, when you sell a project to a big developer, whether it's government or whatever, and I'm talking about some of these huge city size sort of centre projects, it's not just about making something beautiful and presenting it, it's about the economies of it. And you've talked about the circular economy, almost, donut economics, that sort of thing. So you present an idea to somebody, and there's some fantastic results there. I mean, one particular development was 4 million visitors.
12.
A hell of a lot.
12, yeah.
The nighttime economy is huge, obviously, in that area. So, to what extent do you get involved in how do you manage to sell these things from an economic point of view, but not only just the money side, but from a green point of view and sustainable building point of view? Is that enough of a question for you?
Well, it's a good question. I suppose when I did that first project in Singapore, I was a little bit naive. I'd never done a commercial project before. When I was working in Europe, all I was working on were things like railway stations and public buildings, like the Barrage and Marseille, big public buildings. So being exposed to commercial projects was different for me. It was a bit of an anathema to the way that I thought about things, and certainly didn't think about the sort of commercial vitality of the project. and then was totally relieved when it became incredibly successful. You know, and getting 12 million visitors a year, which is quite extraordinary, that the rental values of those units went from 0 to increase by 10, 12-fold. Amazing. Made our client an awful lot of money. But I certainly didn't have my economist hat on at that time. I just was focused on doing the best possible design. But, you know, as you get older, you have a lot more experience, and working in Asia a lot more. You start to think about things like I said when we were working on that project in Singapore Grid about moving dead space in the building to the street front to add more value. So that was the initial conversation with the client. It's not just about the architecture looks wonderful, don't you think, client? Because lots of clients don't think like that. It's about value first. It's about, they had to pay a lot of money to demolish part of the building. It added to the program, which again adds cost. But when you move space that's not getting them any rent and stopping people going there and moving it to the high street where the rent is 4 times as much, they listen to you.
So it's not, in effect, it's not just about the immediate benefit, you know, somebody puts development up, they think about rents, but it's about the community,
Yes.
especially when you're dealing with government. It's about the benefit to the
Indeed,
community.
yeah.
And I suppose, in a way, you at the stage you've got to now, it's not about convincing people by showing them a spreadsheet. It's about saying, look, this is what I've done, and look at this beautiful situation we've created, and the economic benefits, like as we've seen today.
Sure, having a track record helps, but you still need to convince people all the time. They don't give you blank checkbooks. People don't have endlessly deep pockets. Every project's different. Everything is a bit special. So there's a lot of energy that goes into curating the conversation with the client and how to present it. So
Congratulations and thank you.
I think that's enough. I'm knackered now.
Right, go and sit down. Listen, thanks, Stephen. That's amazing. Quite a few of you are still here, which is even more amazing. But thank you very much, Stephen. And listen, watch this space because we've got more events for the next 2 years in the evening at lunchtimes. And please tell your friends to come. Perhaps not advertise the free bar too much, but we would love to see you all. And it's tremendous to hear the questions. And let's have more of the same. So thanks, everybody. And thank you, Stephen. And good night.